7 p.m. on July 22nd. I would like to call to order this meeting of the Tacoma Park City Council. Will the clerk call the roll? Or do we don't need to do that tonight? We just
Right, because this is a special
meeting. We don't need to call the roll. All right, we're here. We are here with our Director of Public Works, our Urban Forest Manager, our Tree Commission, members of our Committee on the Environment, and the City Council to talk about our ordinance regarding trees as well as our tree canopy goals. As many people know, as we started this work during this past year, Councilmember Kovar, Dabala, and Kostic have been taking the lead on this. I want to thank them very much. And because of her wonderful organizational skills and ability to keep track of all the moving parts of this conversation, I'm actually going to ask Councilwoman Kostic to run our meeting this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you. I don't know if I can do that justice, but thank you. I just want to start off by welcoming everybody, as the mayor said. And yep, you can. I really want to thank the Tree Commission and the Committee on the Environment in particular for your work on reviewing all of these really complicated elements and working with us to try to find ways to improve it. As you all know, and the mayor referenced, one of our priorities for this year has been to improve the tree ordinance and develop tree canopy goals, as well as look for ways to improve the outreach and educational aspects of the way that we do trees in Tacoma Park. So this is part of that, and my colleagues will speak a little more to that in a few minutes in terms of the timeline. But this is really just the start of that process in terms of receiving input from the committees. And tonight our goal is to hear from the committees and have a discussion so that we can start to understand what their recommendations are. I expected that this could be probably a 2-day conference with all the information that we have. So we'll try to just distill it as much as we can and get to the main questions and collect any questions when we're finished that we can forward to the committees and discuss further. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Councilmember Dabala, first of all, to talk a little bit about some of the interconnections between the different parts that we're working on.
Hi, everybody. So as Casey said, when we started this, we were focusing on 3 things: the ordinance itself and the policies that go with it, the canopy goals, what are we working towards, and outreach, education, implementation. How do we get there? So within those 3, tonight we're going to talk about. We're going to hear recommendations from the Tree Commission about the ordinance and from the city attorney about the ordinance, and then we're going to talk a little bit about that number 2, the tree canopy goals. They are related clearly, because if you know where you're going, you have a better chance of getting there. But quite seriously, there was work in 2016 on developing an urban tree canopy goal that will probably inform the discussion tonight. There most recently was a University of Vermont assessment of the tree canopy where we are today, and I think some of you were there in March. You look familiar. And within the tree canopy topic itself, again, there are 3 things. There's the overarching goals, the where are we going. There's the measurable objectives, the much more specifics. And again, implementation. And tonight, I think we'll just focus on the first one, the overarching part of it. It doubles back to the ordinance because in the ordinance, there's a section that talks about what's the purpose, and there's some suggestions from the Tree Commission that you'll address about making some changes to that. So I hope that sets the context for tonight. And Councilmember Kovar is going to talk briefly about the timeline going forward.
Thank you, Councilmember Cindy. You know, like a lot of things that we work on here, this will involve a period of months and will unfold in an iterative way, and that can sometimes be frustrating for people, but I think each part builds on the next, and we can't just say today on such and such a date we're going to take this vote. today what we're going to do is begin to talk about the things that my two colleagues just mentioned. And just in terms of the timeline, there have been some earlier timelines floating around, and it gets adjusted periodically. And I do want to just say to people that we don't at this point have anything scheduled in terms of votes. And I think all of us feel that to the extent we're working on changes to the ordinance and also working on developing the tree canopy goals, as well as the outreach portion that my colleague just mentioned, we see those things as marching along together and being aligned. And in some cases, one may move ahead of the other, but they do interact with each other and inform each other. And so I think what we anticipate having happen, and we'll put out at some point a more detailed or revised schedule, but what we anticipate happening is after this, we're going to be on break for a little while soon, and then in September, we'll have another meeting with the council where we'll talk amongst ourselves and obviously hear public comment about how, based on what we hear today and what we've been hearing all along, we think we want to proceed. And then I would anticipate over the fall and part of the winter at least that we would then be working on those things and eventually voting. But at this point, there's no schedule for votes, and there certainly is a recognition that we see how the various strands are intertwined with each other. And, you know, other council priorities and other things that we're doing may also come up that sort of shove the schedule in one direction or another. So just want people to have a sense for that's where we are. That's not that specific right now, but that's about as specific as we can be.
Well, and that's what we're going, one of the things we're going to get information on tonight is, I did forget to mention one other key piece of this besides the recommendations from the committees and the recommendations from staff, the tree canopy assessment and the 500 resident comments. So if you have not had a chance to look at the summary of those comments, they're attached to the June 19th meeting. And it just walks through, it's a presentation that Daryl did in June, walks through the different questions and graphically shows you where the folks who responded are at with the different questions that were asked. It just meant to mention it.
Great. So we envisioned, as the next part of our meeting, getting started hearing from the Tree Commission and kind of getting an overview of what your recommendations were, and then having an opportunity for the council to ask some questions to you. So maybe we could just start off, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves. I think we all know each other, but just so we have a chance to get to know you better.
I'm Tina Murray.
And I'm Carol Houghton.
John Barnwell.
Bruce Levine. Bruce Levine.
Great.
That's Bruce.
Yep. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, well, we're really excited to have this opportunity to present our preliminary findings, and they are preliminary, but they represent about 6 months' worth of work on our part. And as you all have noted, this is a many-headed hydrant. All of the components are interrelated. So this is our best stab at where we start, but we definitely will be going back and forth between the three pieces of this puzzle all throughout. But because we kind of knew that, and because the ordinance itself really does not convey what the lived experience of this law is for our residents, it's translated into a process that is highly regulatory in nature. And because of that, we incorporated the urban forest manager in the formulation of these recommendations. So I think in the main, that office is going to be supportive of what we offer you today, and he definitely will tell you where he does not. Having said that, what we came to some conclusions about strengths and weaknesses. And the strength of the tree ordinance, the philosophy that underpins it, is essentially sound. And sometimes there are specific pieces here and there where we all might get feedback as to why this is the way it is. But in its substance, it's really about protecting the trees and enabling the trees to survive in a built environment, which is essentially what an urban forest is. The trees contribute in environmental, economic, and socio-psychological ways that should be enhanced and maintained. And our sensibility is that there's a fair degree of support for that idea. Tacoma Park understands the contributions of the trees as a communally held asset. So, you know, I live in a condominium, and I bought my condominium because all my windows are filled up with trees, none of which are actually on our property. So this is very near and dear to my heart. I didn't know a lot about the tree ordinance before I moved here, but I knew that the trees were protected. And so that is in part of the reason why I actually live here. So I think that is something that we all kind of widely, at least conceptually, understand, okay? We all agree that the City Council is correctly interested in reviewing the ordinance for sufficiencies in today's community, especially in light of the declared climate emergency. This review revealed several areas in which the ordinance may benefit from adjustment. While the trees are correctly understood to be a community asset, the current ordinance places the burden the trees require us to bear as solely held by the property owners. That somehow seems like that's not in good balance. The current ordinance favors trees that exist under protection, but does not actively promote a dynamic forest management. As a result, we have an aging forest. We don't have a lot of 10-year trees. We don't have a lot of 20-year trees. We have 60, 70, 80-year trees, many of which are kind of sunsetting at the end of their life. Given the wide lack of knowledge and understanding the maintenance of trees requires, residents frequently experience the ordinance itself as an imposition, and it has strong negative connotations in many instances. There are few provisions in the ordinance to reward and incentivize activities that support and foster growth in the canopy. In other words, all sticks and no carrots. So that was what we kind of concluded as we were working through each piece of the law in trying to take the feedback that we've gotten from various factions to imagine how we could make it better. We do this with the understanding that this alone cannot be the end note of the management of our trees. So we also recognize and look forward to engaging on the other activities that are associated with this. We're going to hear tonight how inextricably interlinked they are. Okay, so what thought I would do first is go through the recommendations that you all received from us, which I all hope you had a chance to at least try to look over a little bit, pull out the sequence of steps that a city resident would engage with the ordinance moving forward, and sort of outlining what the changes we're recommending, how they would dovetail with the change of process, and how they would ideally make it a little bit easier for our residents to navigate. So the current process and the current procedures are all set up under the assumption that our tree owners are practicing routine maintenance and are fully integrating tree planting into the management of their property. That's frequently not the case. Okay? The current law does not promulgate a process that is sequential in nature. So frequently that means that homeowners are getting steps out of order, and that causes frustration because they're then sent back to do something else. When we reorganized this, we got in sort of a mix of feedback. The process is too bureaucratic, which is somewhat just inherent in a regulatory process. You have forms to fill out, you have documents to provide, you have to work with an office, it takes time. That probably isn't something you can completely eliminate. But then the flip side of it is that a lot of people think that the urban forest manager should be providing individual consultative services to our community. That's probably not entirely realistically either. But what we felt was that we wanted to front end and require the first steps in order that that initiates the guidance from the urban forest manager's office to get to the appropriate next steps. So the first step in that is the tree impact assessment. And there are a list of criteria in the tree impact assessment, which is 12-12-30. And we felt that those criteria were actually pretty accurate. We do get some pushback from residents that they're too restrictive, but that frequently comes out of a lack of understanding that tree roots are very delicate, they're very close to the surface of the ground, and they're easy to forget because you don't see them, but they do need to be protected. The only recommendations that we made in the tree impact assessment criteria was the 5% active live pruning recommendation. There was some sensibility among the more technically capable among us that that was a bit too restrictive. We could not ascertain any institutional memory of why it was 5%. We looked at this from the standpoint when you are authorizing a homeowner sort of carte blanche to make decisions for themselves. What is the maximum a tree could bear if you take one great big giant limb off, but it's still within the limit? What is the balance where that tree could survive? So we did recommend increasing that from 5% to 10%. The idea of significant, what's significant? We have had moments of consultation with arborists where you're looking at 20% maximum damage to a critical root zone, which is within 50 feet of the root collar of a tree. Could we better define that? So that was a discussion that we thought merited further examination. Because we're looking at really pushing this out as the gateway service to managing the urban forest, we did offer the recommendation of reducing the fee so that it feels less of a barrier. The tree impact assessment, the recommendation that the tree impact assessment be required for approval of a tree removal permit filed for purposes of development. That came out of, there's a conflict, and the tree commission does see hearings on tree removals for development with no plan, no development plan. And we can't judge the development without a plan. It's a very different path to a tree removal process for purposes of development than for purposes of tree health. However, what we were apprised is that is counterindicated. Requiring the tree protection plan for a removal doesn't work with the county permitting process. So the compromise was to ensure that the tree impact assessment garner the information that the tree commission would need for a hearing, with the understanding that the tree impact assessment is required. So we're moving more towards from there is a tree impact assessment with criteria to it actually being the gateway to the next steps in the process. Okay? With permits, there are 3 types of permits. Removal permit for a diseased or dying tree, poor health. Removal permit for development purposes, and a tree protection plan for development purposes. I want to just hold on to the right of appeal because that's come up in a lot of different places, and it's also come at you from different avenues of feedback, including the city attorney, including some residents that have made comment. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Some people asked after the difference between undesirable and invasive. Undesirable doesn't really have a definition. And what the current law does is that pushes the undesirable into the regulatory environment, and not a lot of institutional memory behind what is currently on what we all called the invasive list. So what we're recommending here is invasive does have actually a technical definition. Those are non-native plant species that by their nature inhibit appropriate growth opportunities for native species. So we're looking at, in terms of the code, adding a definition of invasive, and then that naturally will push it through to regulations, and it will somewhat restrict what gets on that list. But we feel that, like, that's appropriate, that people should have a clear understanding that there's a specific reason why tree species are on that list. With regard tree protection plans, what happens with the tree protection plan is that they are highly iterative, and they're very, very much customized to the specifics of the circumstances. So it's not entirely possible that somebody is going to file a tree protection plan and it's going to get reviewed by the urban forest manager. It likely is going to be a negotiated process. But what we have now is you go on the website, the tree impact assessment, tree removal application form, and the tree protection plan are all there, and it's left for the resident to pull what he or she thinks is the right price and the right step. In an area where, and the tree protection plan covers everything from wanting to plant a garden patch, wanting to resurface a driveway, up to building, you know, thousands of square feet of addition, which might impact 2 or 3 or 4 trees. It's not a one-size-fits-all process. And it dawned on one of us, one of the commissioners brought up this idea of, you know, the code says we all pay our taxes, but we don't all use the same forms. You know, there's like a small, medium, and large, depending on where your income comes in. So under this new idea, once the tree impact assessment is assessed, part of that then would enable the urban forest manager to direct the homeowner in the appropriate permitting process according to their circumstances, whether that's a potential removal or if there's a larger, more complex plan that is required. Within that, then, you can break it down into small, medium, and large, and have appropriate samples, appropriate forms and instructions, where you might actually need to bring in technical expertise specifically on trees if you have a complex project, which if you're just trying to resurface your driveway or put in a garden, might not be necessary. So that idea is that that would then give the homeowner a better sense of direction as to what information to provide the urban forest manager, okay? The provision to allow the urban forest manager discretion in requiring an independent arborist evaluation for complex plans, that is offered with a goal towards ending haggling. Because what happens now, if we have a designer who designs a plan for an addition on a house, let's say, and that design is designed without regard for the trees, then it's left to the urban forest manager to retrofit the tree protection onto a design that already exists. And that creates some stress and tension and potential negotiation. Under the current law, if that's not settled, then it's automatically bumped to the tree commission. The goal here is to create the circumstances where the urban forest manager can require the technical expertise that's needed to make a final determination on the project without it then translating into a hearing action. So this seems restrictive on the surface of it, and when it was proposed, that's how it was received. But when we really fleshed out what it meant, it made more sense from the perspective of the service to the homeowner in the bigger picture of things. Okay. The 12-1290 was just a technical issue. That was a case where if there's a tree protection plan granted or tree removal permit granted, and then it goes into the county for processing, sometimes they were coming back against deadline. So that just gives him the authority to extend the deadline and not have to repeat the appeal process to the extent that it remains the same. I think now we're kind of to the point. Okay. This is the point at which I'm going to allow John Barnwell to speak on the modified replant. We're at the level of replanting requirements. We did offer some modifications on the replanting matrix, and I'm going to let John explain where that comes from and what the differences are.
Yeah, so we're on page 5 and page 6 of the little packet here. And basically what the Tree Commission did here in consultation with the urban forest manager was adjust the criterion that the urban forest manager uses to evaluate trees, which then impacts the replacement, to better reflect the technical language and the language that is in refereed journals related to urban forestry work. And so when you see the word target or site factor, those are technical terms that appear a lot in the literature. And so really the goal here was to both align the criterion with the technical language as well as take out some of the room for subjectivity that had been in the previous matrix. So I'd refer to, we changed it to site factor, which is, you know, basically the ability or the area that a tree has to grow, or some other sort of extenuating circumstances could be noted, instead of growth rate per, which was the urban forest manager had the burden to determine if if the twigs had grown 6 inches in a year, or perhaps had grown 2 inches in a year. And so maybe we're alleviating some binocular work for whoever the urban forest manager is, but we work to try and take out some of the other subjectivity. I would say that one notable change in there as well is the change to the life expectancy, which was something that we had seen often in appeals hearings, and really the ability of anyone to say that a tree is going to live less than 5 years or less than 10 years is really up for debate. And so we decided to extend that to 10 years. It used to say less than 5 years. And so most of the time, particularly with the large trees that generally come to the Tree Commission, there's been not that much debate about the level of decline, whether it be 10 years or 5 years. And so we just extended that. And then on the back, the percentage of basal area to be replaced, of course, I'm a forester, so I know what that is, but a lot of people don't know what that is. But just to be clear, Jan has a chart that he works off of that is a matrix of the basal area to be replaced. And in this chart, I would say that these numbers are certainly not the final product, but what we tried to do was, reduce the replacement value for some of the less desirable tree species in the canopy, or the ones that were lower rated, and then raise the replacement. Also, to find the balance, raise the replacement for the really highly rated trees that were considered for removal. So, I think that, this one in particular, since the urban forest manager would be the one responsible for explaining all of these criteria and what is included in the matrix, it was certainly something that was done in concert with the urban forest manager. I think the only thing that perhaps is up for discussion is whether insect and disease is its own standalone category, but otherwise we were pretty well in agreement on adjusting this to use language that is commonly used in the profession. So I'll entertain any questions anyone has on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So in this section 1212-100, this is where I think the real foundational decisions are going to need to be made. In the matrix, we have built in a greater degree of, it's weighted more towards higher fees for healthier tree removal than the current. So that's one way we looked at really trying to adjust this calculation. The thing about the way the calculation works is that the evaluation of the tree enables us to understand the ecosystem services that are provided by that tree in whatever state of health it may be in. The idea of the replanting requirement is to enable the city to compensate for the loss of those ecosystem services. So any adjustment or any favorability in allowing greater freedom in determining when to take trees down means that there needs to be compensation for the lack of funding in the replacements. So it takes an environmental calculus and makes it into an economic calculus. So that's the important thing to remember as you consider what kind of adjustments you want to make to this section of the code. Because we have an invested interest in making sure that we at least maintain where we are, but the overall goal is not to maintain, it's to increase. So that's really, I think, going to be the real foundational decision that the council needs to make, is how you're going to move the stack of cards so that it feels better to the community, at the same time still enables the city to push the environmental issues forward, okay? So some of the things that we considered that are in ordinance review, consider authorizing the urban forest manager the capacity to reduce replanting requirements to incentivize planting on site. And that really originated from my sensibility that I've never been able to get myself spiritually around the idea that we make people pay to take trees down that we want them to take down. So that's sort of in the balance, is trying to find ways to get trees planted on that primary property opportunity to increase the canopy, which is people's yards. Considering the expansion of waiver is something that has come to us quite a bit. That's a little bit tricky in the sense that a lot of the tree removal permits, arguably the majority of the tree removal permits are for trees that are demonstrating various degrees of decline. So if we were to just categorically move that waiver label into that 10 years or less in life category across the board, we would have a significant compensation issue in the matrix there. Those were two things that we thought could be incorporated in the ordinance. There were some additional things that we put in the list of recommendations that are more regulatory or didn't quite fit into the spirit of the ordinance. We had a lot of discussion about the requirements for replacement trees to be nursery grade, to have a year guarantee behind them and things of that nature, because that does add considerably to the expense. And that some people, do foster volunteers in their yards, which are probably more viable trees in the long run, but don't get any credit whatsoever in the short run. And so that was also something that we felt was meritorious. One idea that came up was the idea of setting aside parcels of land, but that doesn't quite rise to the level of like a forest conservation easement, because we're looking at patches that are too small. but it would incentivize giving people credit for allowing what naturally grows in our environment to actually grow. So that was something that kind of came through in a different vehicle.
Are you on this, I don't know, second page? 12-12-105, repeal pre-planting credit program. That's not what you,
No, we're
Just
still at
actually said.
12-12-100.
okay, thank you.
We'll-
That's not a typo.
What?
You want to repeal.
We'll get to that. That question actually came up. We'll get to that. Lot of dialogue about the appeal process and rights to appeal. And I think one thing that unifies all of this and all of the feedback that you've been getting on right to appeal is the fact that the overwhelming majority of appeals are by homeowners who filed tree removal permits that have been denied, okay? We don't get a lot of appeals on tree protection plans. We don't get a lot of appeals on tree removal permits from people who are not property owners. And so I think a lot of what drives this dialogue is the fact that everyone is made to wait 2 weeks to allow people to file an appeal. And it just seems like it's a lot of time on the part of a lot of homeowners that doesn't seemingly serve a meaningful purpose. So that is the question that we have, but we come up with different answers. Some people that you've heard from that were not the tree commission recommended eliminating right of appeal for tree protection plans. Our concern in that is that's delimited to adjacency in the law. And when you're looking at altering your property, you may be impacting other people's trees. So if you didn't have that right of appeal, it seems only proper that you would incorporate the neighbor's rights to participate in the protection of their own trees in some manner. And if the issue is timing, which is not what everybody is saying, but in the issue of timing, you know, it's just moving the timing to a different part of the process. In terms of merit of the appeal, that's an issue that comes up on both sides of the appeal equation. Most of the appeals that we do here are not meritorious. But that is not to say that we don't occasionally get one that is. And it's not a blanket process that we're automatically disposed to agree with the urban forest manager. But the way the appeal process is set up, it does require, it puts the burden of proof on the homeowner to prove that the judgment of the urban forest manager is incorrect. And that's not how most people approach that. I think part of that's an education piece that we can do better on. But I still have concern that anybody in the city can file an appeal on a removal permit of a tree on anybody's property anywhere in the city. So, you know, that might mean adding an adjacency requirement. Another question that came up was, is adjacency really fair if you're dealing with small parcels of land? You know, your project might affect a tree that's 2 doors down. You could change that to critical root zone. That might, so there might be different ways of addressing, but adjacency definitely is one. And we did not come down clearly. We came down pretty clearly in wanting to keep the tree protection plan right of appeal. We had some discussion about the tree removal permit right of appeal. So that's rights of appeal.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
In terms of the permit appeal process, to what extent do we receive neighbors appealing a permit, a tree removal permit request? Is that something that happens frequently, or is it rarely ever the case that you have people?
We had this conversation. If you just asked me personally, I would say once in the 4.5 years I've been on the commission.
Okay.
And what happened in that particular case was, when she heard the specifics of the case, she withdrew before we even got to deliberations. And I was like, why are we sitting here? That should have been explained, apart from, pulling us all together and making this homeowner wait 30 days while we pulled the hearing together. That's really the concern. There was one where it was a development property. Technically, according to the paperwork, it was a tree removal permit, but it was arguably for development purposes, and it was presented that way. And the neighbors pulled in. Now, that technically, arguably, was pointed out to me that it was a tree removal permit, but we processed it as a development permit, because he wouldn't have filed if he wasn't planning to build a house on that land.
Okay.
The tree protection plan side of it, I think I know we had one, but I clearly remember. I don't know that in the last 4 or 5 years.
We have pulled together records of the last 5 years, so we'll be able to provide that.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So but it's those kinds of numbers over periods of years. And every single person who files a permit request has to wait 2 weeks for the appeal process to play out.
I'd say tree protection plan permits get appealed. Tree protection plan permits get appealed by neighbors probably once every 3 to 4 years.
Yeah. Okay. The criteria for permit decisions also came up. In general, we don't object to their substance. We have some concerns about their organization. The thing that we deliberate most on is the concept of hardship. Right now, hardship has no legal definition, so it is what we make of it. It's a challenge in a hearing situation to determine a hardship case. So that's something that we might want to get a little bit more in depth with what we actually mean by hardship. But for the most part, they're kind of unwieldy to work with as they are. It's not so much what they mean as just the way they're presented. We know we've aspired to do better on the education piece when people are offered the opportunity to appeal a decision, to make sure that the applicant understands their rights and obligations under the law. And hopefully that would remove some of those non-meritorious cases. So we're very grateful that this year seems to have turned the year where 2017 and 2018 we had 9 appeals each year. This year we've had 1 so far. So thank you. People seem to be happier about their decisions. So that's a basic summary of the changes that we've recommended in the hopes that it will sequence and provide the homeowners a better understanding of what their obligations and duties under the law are. So I guess at this point, if there's any additional specific questions on those points before we move on.
Could I ask a question? Hi.
Yeah.
So when you started your overview this evening, you talked about trees being a public benefit, and we kind of put it on the property owner as the onus of maintaining and handling that. Did you talk about any recommendations for how to spread the expense or something else of this? And I don't know if that's exactly the point here, but clearly, as part of your recommendations do potentially increase the cost to an applicant. So I was trying to think about what does that mean from a financial perspective?
Well, there's one thing I forgot to mention is the fee formula, which right now is regulatory. So right now, a replacement fee is $175. That doesn't even cover the cost of the tree. One of the things that we've kind of moved along with Jan on is this idea of resiliency. So, it's finding that weight in the balance, but clearly if we empower the urban forest manager's office to reduce the number of trees in a requirement in order to incentivize planting on site, that's a dialogue that has really stepped up because we all know that's where our primary planting area is. Conceptually, that makes sense, but it does mean that there is a drop in the revenue in the fund, potentially. So in the non-ordinance recommendations, there is a directive to consider fiscal modifications required by the amendments and replanting requirements. So that means, do we all collectively as a community chip in? What does that look like? What we realized is we're not enough of the money crunchers to really get granular with that, but we're advising the council to really look at that and see how that would work. Because that concept that we all, quite frankly, I feel guilty because the tree that fills up my living room window, they had to bring in a crane to deadwood it. And, so that's a very, very responsible homeowner who is taking care of this glorious tree that enhances my life immeasurably. And it just seems right to me that I should be contributing somehow to that cause. That's more on the aesthetic, psychosocial level. But, in this day and age, our trees are putting back into our environment all of the crappy stuff that we're putting out there. We need to grow the canopy. And we all need to contribute to the growing of the canopy. So I think philosophically, if we're looking at this from the perspective of community stewardship, we need to really examine it as a community and not just put it back on the people who happen to buy the house that has the big tree that's been there for 50, 60, 70 years. Yeah.
I would add that, and maybe the Committee on the Environment's going to address this, but the joint committee of Committee on the Environment and Tree Commission members spent some time thinking about this, and so we have some ideas, but I wouldn't call any of them well developed at this point, but there are some ideas that have been floating around in a list as far as exploring something similar to stormwater credits and a few other ideas related to tree maintenance.
Mm-hmm. And that's also us taking the finger of your pulse, like if we're declaring that we're in a climate emergency, what are we going to do about it? So in the event that that is deemed not plausible or possible in this review, what we do recommend is looking at funding the tree emergency fund so that people who have diseased and dying trees have the capacity to get some support for replacements on a need base. So that was sort of a compromise. And I think also in these matrices, the foundation of the law says we put an ecological value on the tree, we translate that into dollars and cents, and then that creates resources for the city to put into the fund. How does that actually play out in reality? Are we actually replacing the canopy? The last assessment suggests maybe not quite as much as we might like, but there's also a decision to be made in that area as well. What that dynamic and what that matrix actually represents, what the city wants for itself, is a legitimate question, I think.
All right, we're starting to run a little late. I knew we would anyway, so it's no big deal. But I know there's definitely interest in people hearing from you regarding the pre-planting credit program, and I think you have maybe you have a couple other points you want to make before we open up for questions?
There were some other questions that came up, and, feel free to chime in if you're not hearing something. I will apologize if I've forgotten something we got into advance. The thing about the replanting requirement, again, it starts with, 1, filing in the 2.5 years that you're on staff, the Urban Forest Manager's Office. So that's clearly a program that is not working. It's clearly a program that isn't working when everyone who's purchased a bulk buy tree that's not meant for a replanting requirement is actually eligible to register their trees. So we started from that standpoint, and to be perfectly honest with you, we couldn't get through. It is so dense. I couldn't make sense of it. We just couldn't make sense of it. So, it almost seems like we need to come up with some different ways of giving people credits rather than trying to wade through this and figure it out. If you really want us to, we can rethink that, but that was the logic behind it.
So you're not saying... You're not saying repeal the program. You're not saying don't give credit for pre-planting. You're saying totally rethink how we give credit. Okay.
That's correct.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think I get it now. Thank you.
You don't advertise it, so that could be why only one person's done it. I couldn't say.
But when you totally rethink it, one of the things you have to consider is repealing it, because it may just not be manageable. And there are a lot of better options that have been dismissed as not manageable, like putting aside land or promising to nurture your volunteer trees that you already have on your property. It's just impossible to keep track of. So unless there's something you can actually do that will work, it just raises expectations. So, but there may be a better way. It's worth trying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would add that if it did get advertised and it was a popular thing, we've identified that it would be a real burden on Public Works to keep track of all of the, as it's currently written, keep track of all of the pre-planting requirements, and so that was a concern as well.
All right, are there other questions from council? Yeah, Councilmember Kober.
Can you talk a little bit about evaluating hazardous trees? You have in the language that you're proposing here the idea that 10 years or less of remaining life would be, in a third category in terms of how the trees would be evaluated. One of the things that I hear from residents a lot is that there are trees that are potentially hazardous either to life or property, and it can be challenging to have that evaluation, and maybe to some extent that's more of a art than science to make that decision. But in terms of what you guys see on the commission, do you think that definition should be changed, or should that process in evaluating that piece of it be modified?
You know what I think that, and this is my view, but what I think that is more is a lack of maintenance on the part of the homeowner. Because when you go decades without any maintenance on a tree and you have no documentation of the history of your tree, it's very hard to judge what is exactly going on with that tree. And you've probably experienced your constituents having a much greater uptick on recommendations for more aggressive analysis of the state of their trees to determine what's going on because there's no history there. And I think that what's a hazard is different than what is legally defined as hazardous. And people will get into their minds under whatever determination is driving them in a certain direction to think that a tree is a threat. But that in and of itself doesn't determine whether or not the tree is a threat.
But if there is a specific means to be able to determine a tree as a threat, then there is means in the law to deal with that. Now, one thing I can say is that in Ken's memo, he brought up this notion of granting a waiver based on proximity. And that comes from a different interpretation of hazardous, because all of my time in the tree commission, we've understood that a tree that's impinging on, you could have a very, very healthy tree that's impinging on a crack in your foundation, where clearly that is creating a problem for the building, even though the tree itself may be perfectly healthy. That's always been our understanding of falling under the category of hazardous. So from the perspective of if the lawyer doesn't get that, that might be something that we would need to look at. But I think with homeowners, a big piece of it is just not having robust information.
But so
on
even
their
if we
trees.
were to, in the third leg of the stool, so to speak, find better ways of circulating to the community information on tree health and maintenance, it's not like every single homeowner is going to say, oh, I didn't realize that, now I'm going to do it. Every 2 years I'm going to have my arborist come in. Most people still won't do it, just as most people don't think about their roof for 30 years or whatever it is. So given that, even though maybe what you're saying is true, is that just the way it goes, or is there something else that we can do?
Well, you know, when somebody neglects their roof for 30 years, they might suffer consequences from that, and that's just something that we all have to kind of cope with.
Right, but
I
they get
think it's easier-
to decide what to do with it, though, right? That's the difference.
Yeah, but in terms of a tree removal process, the city is providing them with an evaluation from a licensed arborist.
I would
So-
add that was part of the changes to the matrix, that offers two things that the matrix didn't have before as Jan evaluates the trees, and one of those is the target. And so target in tree, in urban forestry language considers what the tree would fall on if it were to fall. And so my explanation has been a tree on the slope in the backyard of someone's property might be a little bit different than the identical tree that was overhanging a daycare center playground. And that is dependent on Jan's evaluation of the tree, and part of the reason why we included target in the new matrix, as well as why we included the site factor as well. So if a tree had clearly outgrown its growing box, or had some other thing that was impeding root growth, then that would be something that could come under consideration. So those are two changes that have been made by the tree commission
That's
as
helpful.
well.
That's
too.
helpful. One other question, and then other people can ask as well. So you talked, Tina, about defining invasive and so on, which I think is better than the other term, undesirable. But how do you see the invasive versus the native issues, so that, from the perspective of promoting stronger biodiversity and so on? Should that be, to what extent should that be built into it, in your opinion?
My fellow commissioners have a viewpoint on this.
Well, I certainly do. I mean, my feeling is that we should encourage the planting of natives, and we certainly want to discourage the planting of invasives. Now, not all non-native trees or plants are invasive, so you can plant innocuous trees that are not native, but they don't have the same wildlife value as a native. And another thing to keep in mind is that a plant that is considered non-native but innocuous today may actually be declared invasive tomorrow, because and particularly with changing climate, that's going to affect.
Well, I agree with that, but I guess
yeah.
should it be built into it, into the matrix in some way?
Maybe not in the matrix, but I think it could be. Well, it could be included in the matrix, or it could be included elsewhere in the ordinance. But I, for one, do believe strongly that we should include natives, planting of natives as a desirable goal
Okay,
within the ordinance,
Okay.
yes. That's my opinion.
thank you.
Are there others who have questions?
Just to follow up on that, it seems like when you mention climate change, that what's native in this environment may, if the environment's changing, that something else may be more appropriate in the future.
Well, that's certainly true, and it's actually going to be, I think, somewhat difficult to predict what's going to survive, because climate change is not going to be uniformly getting warmer, of course. We're going to continue to see extremes of temperatures as well as precipitation. So one way to approach this would be to look for species that have high environmental, what's the term? Adaptability to a wide range of conditions, so precipitation as well as temperature. So I don't think you could just say, well, we can plant zone 7 trees and in preference to zone 6. But yeah, that is going to be another consideration. But I think that's also, I think, would be very difficult to build into the ordinance itself.
Any other questions before we move on? Great, you've had us stunned into silence.
Well, they did such a good job answering. I had all my questions, you answered them all.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I found this really helpful, and it's clear to me that there's going to be a balance between protecting the trees, creating an ease of use for residents, and then also just the funding component and making sure that there's adequate funding for what we need to do through the replanting requirements and the fees. So maybe we can work on collecting some further questions if there are any that pop up, and we'll submit them to the commission, and we'll just continue to have this conversation moving forward. So thank you very much. Let's then move on to the Committee on the Environment and your thoughts on tree canopy goals. This is obviously a little more of a work in progress. I know that you aren't here to provide us with your recommendations at this point in time, but it'd be great to hear sort of where you're at with that and where you're leaning and how that interacts with the ordinance as well. And maybe we could start off again and just have members of the Committee on the Environment introduce yourselves.
So I'm a former member of the Committee on the Environment. I was chair most recently and have been working on this project for the last 6 months and have continued since my official term ended. But we had a separate working group that was part of the subcommittee of the Committee on the Environment that was working on this with the Tree Commission. And the other people are...
My name is Jeff Broke. I'm on the Committee for the Environment, and we're glad that SJ is sticking with us.
Helen Gelban. I'm on the committee, but I'm not on the working group, so I'm here just to listen.
There are 3 other working group members who are not here tonight. So we had 5 folks contributing in some ways.
And they're all from the Committee on the Environment?
5 people from the Committee on the Environment that were working with the Tree Commission on this whole project. So I wrote up a document, and I will be going through some points here. We're speaking about the canopy goal. I want to first say that canopy goal is not just about a quantity. It's not just a number. It also should be defined as a quality that looks at not just the overhead tree coverage that you could see from the analysis that we received, but also the health of the tree, the ages of the trees, diversity of the species, and it also gives some measure of the diversity of the age and the height as a projection toward what would be happening in the future. Some of that information was discernible from the LiDAR data and analysis we had in the past, just most recently. And I'll speak more about on-the-ground inventory later. So currently, we have about a 60% tree coverage average for the city. It's a little bit disparate depending on which part of the city you're in, if it's a commercial area or if it's different wards, especially Ward 6, which has a lot of commercial area, but also I think the single-family home tree density is also lower in those areas as well. So we're at about 60%. Regionally, that's pretty tops. Hyattsville might be near there. Greenbelt, I think, is the only local city that has a higher percentage. I'm not sure exactly. That might be due to a lot of park space that they have, but that's pretty high for a peri-urban environment. As a comparison, DC is at 35% as of 5 years ago. I don't know what they are now. Cindy mentioned having some overall goals. And where do we want, that's where we are. Where do we want to be? I haven't spent a lot of time trying to put a percent number on that. I think there's a lot of factors that will go into that. The overall mission of this process is said to maintain and expand. So you may assume that it should be more than 60%, or maybe our goals are really a hedge against future loss. If our determination is that our current canopy is actually not in great health and is dying rapidly, and we do not have enough understory trees that are going to replace it underneath, we may decide that we want to aim a little higher just to maintain, or in the face of increasing climate changes, either storm events or increasing temperatures. So all of that's a little bit to be discussed later. More of this talk is trying to look at some implementation ideas and how they would impact the canopy. So we're going to look at some of the things we've already discussed, some of the suggestions from the ordinance, maybe also some program ideas for the city that could be investments in the trees and how we might expect them to impact the development of the canopy. So the categories I wanted to look at first is kind of overall ideas that public relations is somewhat of an issue. Either some people love the tree ordinance or they hate it. Either they've had a good experience living in the city or enjoying the trees, and maybe even had a good experience working with a process of development or doing some work on their house, or they've run up against it and have a dislike for it and have some resent about either the process itself or the actual rules that restrict what they can do on their property. So in order to have an improvement on that factor, to have a better appreciation both of the trees they experience themselves or just the intention of the rules, there may be a desire to make it easier, make it more flexible process. And if there was basically a better feeling about the tree ordinance itself, then people may be more supportive of it, generally of it, and of any changes or taxes related to or costs that are associated. Moving on, I don't know if there's, so I would just say that if there was a better public relations, probably have a better canopy, at least healthier. I don't know if it'd be more expansive. Moving on to conversation about carrots and sticks. We've heard that the ordinance is a lot of sticks, and maybe in an effort to have a bit better PR, you would reduce those sticks. Either make things less costly, moving faster, less restrictive, or more flexible. And all of those would probably tend to decrease the canopy. If you can more easily take down a tree or impact a tree, then it's more likely that it'll either come down or be damaged or have a lower life. So that would be a negative impact. But in order to balance that, you may try to counter that with lots of additional carrots. So right now, I think we have the existing pre-planting credit, which I think is only allowed with nursery grade trees. So some other ideas would be to include volunteer trees or some other kind of tree that if you can document that it has a replacement value of a nursery tree, then you could get some credit for it. You could get some credit for doing regular maintenance on your trees. There could be a rebate program with a funding mechanism to be determined, and there could also be a lot more credit for on-site replacements, which, as Tina mentioned, that's one of the prime targets of where there's plantable land, especially if you're losing a tree from a private property. It'd be great to be replacing it on site. So any ways that we can balance a reducing of the negative impacts of the sticks in our current current system and increasing the carrots will probably at least have a balanced effect on the impact of the towards the tree canopy. I want to speak some more about the quantity and, oh no, I pretty much said it. I was going to talk about the quantity and the quality again, but I pretty much covered it. There is, I haven't done extensive research, but I said 60% is a relatively large canopy coverage. When looking at some of the regional tree canopy goals, one number that popped out a lot was having something above 40% for a semi-urban environment is kind of what's the target for making water quality improvements. And this is whereby you try to slow down stormwater or filter it before it gets to the creeks and goes eventually to the bay. That might be kind of a minimum. We definitely wouldn't want to fall below. But we may want to, as I said before, aim for something higher to increase some of the other benefits, local air quality, local cooling effects, economic and social improvements in quality of life. And also, if we're going to include a climate change emergency as part of our priorities around trees, that would be another reason to maintain a above average or even an increasing canopy. The next category I want to talk about is community assets and community funding. Our ordinance, makes the claim that the tree is a community asset and it's being regulated by the community, even though it's on private property. And potentially a way to acknowledge this is that there would be, like the stormwater fee, there would be some kind of tree fund fee that's collected, assessed to everybody. And that would create a funding stream that could be accessed by anybody who has a property that hosts a tree. So if you have trees or a certain amount of canopy and you take care of it, or you plant trees, or you eventually have costs of removal, all these things that are kind of negatives, the cost burden of a tree, that there could be some rebate program available from support for the city. Because what we've done is we've privatized the cost of the tree by making the homeowners responsible for it. And since they're bearing a personal cost for the community asset, maybe there's a way that we should be funding it from a community standpoint. A couple specific ideas on this is to think about how you'd assess it in a not too regressive way. You may peg that, you may calculate the tree fund fee based on property value or based on property area. So larger properties would pay more. Right now, the stormwater fee for residential is the same for a large lot or a small lot, or a lot that has a big driveway or a small driveway. So, so if you had some kind of fee, you may want to make it proportional to the property value or the property area. There may also be a credit that you could earn if you had a large canopy existing or that you've nurtured on your property. So you could reduce your tree fund fee by having a robust canopy hosted on your site. Beyond that, I wanted to talk about a couple of practical matters to consider when we're thinking about the tree canopy and potentially increasing it. We're in a semi-urban environment that's close to a number of transit areas, and there's desire to have some more density, at least close to the metro or close to Purple Line and close to bus lines. If you were successful in increasing housing density or any other kind of density around those areas, you would probably expect to have a loss of tree canopy associated with those developments. So kind of want to keep in mind that success in density development could be a negative on tree development, or exactly. There could be a policy that you devise that new development projects would aim for a no net loss result. So if there's an argument to take out X number of trees, they would have to be replacing them possibly at a higher level than we currently have for the calculation for kind of run-of-the-mill residential development. The city has recently said that we have a climate emergency, and if we want to have our trees contribute to solving those problems, maybe we should be having going for a much higher canopy goal. then would be presumed for general quality of life or stormwater treatment goals. For staffing, right now we have one full-time employee and some parts of other staff that help with the trees. And if we're going to spend effort investing in maintaining and expanding the tree canopy, you're probably going to need to consider investing in staff or contractors or somewhat. And one last thing, a question about, do we need more data? Our University of Vermont analysis was a top-down LiDAR airplane view that gave us a pretty good picture of what we have. It did not give us an on-the-ground complementary picture of the health, age, and diversity of species, and a little bit the diversity of anything that exists below that canopy. It would probably cost at least a decent amount of money to collect that data, and you might be able to do it on a sampling basis instead of trying to get a citywide version. You do little pockets here and there to get some estimates and help you with implementation plans or future plans. A secondary benefit of doing maybe a citizen-run inventory is that people who are engaged in learning about their trees and counting their trees are probably likely to be want to invest more in those, or at least be aware of what's there and where the future of those might be going. And that's, I think, all I had in my presentation. I did write up a couple, I'm going to pause though, a couple ideas on throwing out some percentages and talking about them, and also talking about maybe a specific housing or property situation that may impact when some of these rules were applied. I think that's a good thing to do, is to eventually take some of these very specific ideas and take a subject property and say, well, what happens if you had the new rules on this property? Or what happens if you had the new rules on this type of property? So that may be time for the future discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Does anyone have questions or comments? Go ahead.
Guess it's me. Thank you for the presentation. One thing I would also encourage thinking about is when it comes to new development, it's not just based on replacement, but also based on incentivizing the creation of more green space. In Ward 6, it wouldn't be a replacement issue because there are no trees to replace. So if we are talking about some sort of housing, mixed-use development, particularly that would happen around the future Purple Line site, then it is, let's start thinking now about what potential requirements could be for new development projects, particularly in some of the areas of the city that don't have a robust tree canopy. Because again, it wouldn't be about replacement, it would be about creation. And we would have to, because all of that property is private property, try to come up with some sort of incentive for developers to create more green space and add to the tree canopy in those areas. So that is something that I would just encourage us to start thinking about now, especially as, you know, there's some parts of the city where there's definitely a replacement component, but there are other parts of the city where that replacement piece isn't there, which you could basically replace asphalt with more asphalt.
I think a little bit of that community funding and community support rebate type program would very likely apply to a development project. They would be like, I've got this lots of space here. I like it to be nice, and hey, look at that. The city's going to help me pay for doing it. So that would, and then the rest of the city would be charged for that benefit that would be on their private property, but providing localized green space for the area.
Totally agree. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was,
No, she
go ahead,
she
Jeff.
outright
Jeff, no,
ranks me.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Because this is on, I just want to say that I think that it might be more useful, instead of thinking about an overall canopy goal, of we have it 58 now, should it be 63 or something like that, instead think about what it is that we're trying to achieve, what kind of benefits we're trying to get. And just an example of that would be, like the council has as first priority, a livable community for all. And so what would be involved with regard to engaging the benefits of trees and making that possible and doing that? And you can actually do that for each one of the 5 benefits, or priorities, I should say, that the council has laid out. And so I think what the challenge should be is to think about the benefits trees provide and how it is that we can engage in improving our community with that and develop goals along that line. So they'd be like sub-goals. And then in that process, you could sum that up, meeting those sub-goals to get an overall canopy goal. But I think that'd be what we should be charged to do, basically. And if I make one other question, I was hoping that Peter will ask the Committee on the Environment the same question about invasive trees that he asked to the committee, the Ordinance Committee, but.
So you're going to answer it now?
I can't. I'm hoping.
You could just say right now.
Oh, I do have a.
Could you repeat the question?
The question had to do, well, Peter, do you want to ask it again? Because you're more articulate than I am.
Let's say I asked it, now you can answer.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just remind people what the question was about. It had to do with invasive tree species and about the ordinance and basically how that might be adjusted or how does it treat that. I think there should be adjustments to that. I was really quite shocked when I got here and we had Norway maples in my lot, and I got the fellow over, the arborist over, and he said, oh yeah, no, you can't cut those down, and you got to replace them with this, and that. Well, Norway maples are banned in some states. You can't even sell them in some states, and the USDA has identified them as being a major problem, and certainly in New England and so on. So, yeah, I think there should be some changes. Not only should there maybe be a waiver for these invasive species, I might even suggest there being a bounty on them, because they really are very destructive. So
Can I just ask one thing about that?
Yeah.
Even if they're bad in that way and bad from the perspective of not promoting biodiversity, do they still have a carbon sequestration?
Yes, they do still
component?
have
Right.
ecosystem services
Right.
benefits,
Right.
which is the reason why we charge replanting requirements for invasive species.
So that would somehow have to be woven into it.
No,
I think.
I agree. Like Norway maples, if you're going to go, if you're going to go for the thickest canopy, the most sequestering of carbon, and greatest shade and lowering of temperatures, Norway maple is the way to go, 100%. There are other trees that can do similar things and don't have the negative effects that Norway maples have. And so I agree with you that in fact, almost all these invasive species, whether it's porcelainberry, Korean honeysuckle, or whatever it is, sure, they have some benefits, but the costs are extremely high. Right. And so I'd say move them and, put in trees that do that and other
The one thing to
benefits.
think about is, it's one thing to say we won't plant them anymore, whether that also means how easy we would make it to get rid of them if they're providing this other service, quote unquote. That's what we'll have to grapple with, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'll write an essay on that and give it to you.
I'd like to make one final comment on the COE presentation about the evaluation of the canopy and the fact that we didn't get it ground up this time. We did address that in our recommendations in the section currently labeled in the ordinance as role of the arborist, which really is about strategic directives. So we would really like to get the top down and the ground up in a cycle that's routine so that the city can budget appropriately for that, because we feel like we're working with a half a set of data right now. And we also offered some other recommendations with regard to strategic planning so that we're all moving year on year in the same direction. So I think that's actually a really helpful piece, and it's a piece that overlaps.
Are you talking about 12-12-140?
Yes.
The section about establishing a plan for canopy goals and the 5-year cycle and all of that? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So is, yeah, go ahead.
You want?
Go ahead.
I just have one other comment just about the canopy, or not comment, but set of thoughts. When you look at the LiDAR data over the 10 years it looks pretty good because it was at one level, it went up, and then it kind of went down. And so that looks pretty steady if you average it out. But if you look at just from the second one to the most recent one, it actually dropped down something like 5% or a little bit more. So we don't know for sure if we're just seeing this kind of thing or if something's actually happening right now. So it seems to me, in terms of setting the canopy goals, what we want to do is start from a point saying, and this relates to what was spoken of a moment ago about the development, we want no net loss of what we have, and then figure out how we're going to expand upon it in some of the ways that SJ talked about. But to me, then, to do that, the calculation has to be, let's look at the trends that Darrell mentioned of how many permits have been put out over the past 5 years, and so estimate, well, we're probably going to lose this many trees through that. Maybe it'll be easier, maybe it'll be less easy, we don't know. And then also look at, and one of the things I'm really worried about is the loss of the mature, larger trees, including some of the big ones, the oak trees, and I'm looking at my biodiversity friends right here because that's a big source of that. But so, say at a minimum, no net loss, then we know we're going to lose some through that, through the storms, through the perfectly legitimate ones that will be done through the ordinance. So figure out how to overcome that and then begin to talk about, okay, how are we going to target additional areas, including private property, where we want to make it. But it seems to me, unless we start from that point of view, no net loss, but we know we're having loss, so how do we compensate for that before we start picking these other, and I'm not saying you picked them out of the air, they're good percentages to think about, but that's just how I sort of see the canopy thing. So no one has to answer that unless they want to.
Well, no, I would just say that we talked a lot about this as the joint committee, which is why wherever that vision statement is, or the memo that you got, came with what we wanted collectively from the urban forest. So it didn't focus solely on the canopy, and I think that's an important point to consider. The ordinance as written is a fantastic tree preservation ordinance. It's not as good as at promoting sort of a dynamic, resilient canopy of various ages and stages of life, which of course is hard to write because you have to provide some certainty. And in this, a tree that's whatever it is, 7.5 inches DBH is a tree, and that is a tree with the ordinance. But so I think it's when in discussion of this and talking and the focus on the tree canopy, we all have to be careful to think about what we want from the urban forest as a whole, which includes the tree canopy, which includes, ordinance that promotes a healthy tree canopy, but there's a lot more that needs to be considered as well.
So I was going to follow up along a similar vein that I really like the way that Jeff framed it, that instead of talking about a percentage of trees, we're talking about what are the benefits. Climate issues is clearly one area, but it's not the only one. And so it seems like it segues very nicely into the recommended legislative purpose, the changes that the additions you all recommended, the Tree Commission recommended on legislative findings section to recognize the diverse benefits of the urban forest. And that seems to lead very nicely to some general statement, which I don't think we have now, of a diversity of species, health, ages, height. You could tinker around with the words a little. But I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we actually have that. And so rather than get all 60%, 58%, whatever, maybe we should start with something like that. I'm looking at people and nobody seems to. So that's just a thought. And I did want to explore a little bit more the usefulness and whether it's practical to try to do an on-ground inventory and how you would do that if you were going to do it on some kind of a regular basis, to complement. So that as Peter was saying, the LiDAR data shows us the picture from the top. So that means you don't really see what's underneath. You don't see the growing trees that will someday be part of the canopy. You don't see the bushes, the invasive shorter tree. You don't get a complete picture of what kinds of trees you're looking at. And so what would it look like if we did that? Could we do it as a citizen inventory? Would we need to hire some professionals to do something like that? I'd like to get people's thoughts about that.
Let Jan go first.
Yeah, so I checked a little while back with a company that does inventories. So I think there's two different things. There's the street tree inventory.
That's an inventory of specific
of the street
trees
the
and what
city,
they are.
the city trees. So that's one thing. I think the cost, a ballpark figure, is about $40,000 potentially, and then you also have an inventory that can be done of trees citywide, also on private property. And one way to do that is by using sampling plots, kind of a bit similar to the Forest Conservation Act. It's very expensive to do that. The other issue that is a big issue, that you have to go on private property and get people's permission. So you would have to, there's a lot of, it's a complex process that really requires somebody who's very knowledgeable with that process and professionals to do that. And it's also, the ballpark figure that I got was about $60,000-$70,000, and that's very ballpark. There's a lot more to work out, but it's possible, but it's not so easy to do.
Jan, can I ask you a follow-up question on that? And when you do that type of collection of information, how long does that last? Like, how long is that good for in terms of really us understanding the tree canopy? Like, what's the shelf life of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so with a street tree inventory, the idea is that it's updated regularly, and that's an issue with a lot of jurisdictions, the updating. So one thought would be to do that every 5 years in conjunction with the tree canopy assessment. I think the cost would go down if you do it, more regularly. Ideally, it would be kept up and maintained as trees are removed and street trees are planted. So some jurisdictions are able to do that. I think the District of Columbia, they have a lot of urban foresters, and they have Casey trees. So they're able, I think, to maintain that, but for a lot of issues. For the kind of the citywide and also for private property, that's a bit harder to. So what's the shelf life? I think it would be good to do it maybe on a 10-year time span, and I think that's really hard to maintain. Also, I think because of the complexity and the cost, I think you would want to, have a longer time span.
On the street trees, right?
No, the other one.
I just wanted to add too, and I think it'll be really critical as we move forward to remind ourselves of property ownership and where the bulk of our canopy is. And when we look at how tree canopy is distributed in the city, it's largely on private property, obviously, but it's also largely on park and planning property. So where our forest is tends to be, if not private, then organizational. So moving forward with a ground-up tree canopy analysis, and I was in my college days part of a crew that went and did tree inventories on the Allegheny National Forest, so well-versed in the topic. So you get snapshots and you make assumptions based on that. We had access to wherever we wanted to go. Doing that in the city would be challenging because you'd have to, of course, have permission, so there'd have to be a whole public outreach process and understanding about what was trying to be done. There's been some really interesting proposals developed by people who care a lot about this stuff, about a volunteer type of effort or using sort of an app of some type that people could do it on their private property. And I think that would be a really interesting effort to see where it could go. However, whether or not we would get data from that we could really then apply on a scientific basis is truly unknown because of the quality of the data as well as how far, again, you're gonna have pockets where people are into it and other large swaths of the city where people are not into it or not knowledgeable or not even able to consider doing it. So it's a really interesting conundrum. And one of the things that makes this, where we really have to look back at our thumbprint of what our city is, we really have to keep that in mind in terms of land ownership and access and where the canopy is.
I'd like to also say that where we might be able to do this in conjunction with a different project makes sense. So if we're talking about a different way to calculate the stormwater fees, which are how much of your property is impervious surface and that approach, and can you get credit for having the trees? And if so, what kind of trees? As part of that calculation, that could be something that then people have an incentive to figure that out. Certainly, as we look at development, that's going to be something that gets examined very carefully. The one thing I guess I'm not completely sure of is what value a kind of a down-up study gets us. Is it enough outcome of data that helps us really make a decision? Or is it more that it's good to know and maybe, so I guess the question is that balancing act as well. So I guess where we can do it as part of something else and in conjunction with something else, that we try to get some of those incentives, the better. If there is a specific problem, then maybe that app or whatever can focus on that particular problem, and that's something that I'd love to know too.
Or maybe on particular parcels of city land to try it out and to see how feel. Anyway, I just wanted to get people's.
I was just going to say that we've had engagement on this issue very specifically, and I think a couple of points that I can make is that we're dealing with where we are right now today and the decisions that we have to make and the information that we have to make the decisions that we need to make today. And that is that we have the top down, but not the bottom up. So that feels very incomplete, and it feels like the results and the outcomes, there'll be more room to question the results and the outcomes because we're working with an incomplete data set. The other thing, though, is where this projects into the future. Oh, the other thing about where we are today is we did look into software applications, and it still requires tree identification and a reasonable good estimate of health. And that's really hard for the general public to get their mind around. There just really aren't really good data collection points. There are some, but we couldn't come up with a here and now option for that. The other piece, though, is moving into the future, that every time we do the LiDAR sweep, it gives us more complex data. And they are projecting at a certain point that they will be able to identify species, but it's probably a good 10 years out. So it may be also looking at sort of what are we doing in the interim until the technology gives us more robust information based on practices we're already engaged in. That's a very real possibility, but it's a little bit of a ways off.
I was just wondering, in terms of the inventory and getting the public involved, and I don't know whether this would be meaningful, but when we did the energy challenge, you had these block captains, and there was this sort of competitive thing. And again, you're not going to get comprehensive data, but maybe there would be a way, just block by block, to have people who were really focused on it, who could help gather the information, as opposed to just sending everybody out into their backyard, which probably wouldn't work. So sometimes the competitive thing can help.
Mm-hmm. And I just threw out, one other idea, and I don't even know what would work, but the idea of an app is really intriguing. The other thing is that each year, groups of Boy Scouts are always looking for projects. to do in the community. One year they went around and replaced people's smoke detectors. They did the bat houses this year. And again, I know this is complex and may not work, but I just think it might be interesting to see, even if on a small pilot area, if there were groups of Boy Scouts looking for their next project, maybe getting them involved in some of the tree stuff might be useful.
So setting aside the very real question of staff time to organize and supervise this, I get that. But there are also half a dozen or more people who live in the community who are knowledgeable enough and at a point in their lives where they could take on a volunteer project. I'm thinking about the folks who at one point volunteered for the Woodland and Circle property to do a tree inventory there. Just a thought. But what I was interested in was is this question of if you have a percentage goal and you have a LiDAR survey, okay, you've got it. But if you've got a diversity of species, ages, health, benefits goal derived from the benefits that you want to have, then how do you capture that? And do you need something like this? And if you do, how would you even go about doing it? Yeah, that's what
Yeah,
I
and
need
one
to-
thought that I had on the canopy goal issue, Jeff and I have had this conversation where I do think there's some merit in the number, but the number can be based on different things. And one thing that's recently come into my mind is we always talk about a 5-year goal, and it doesn't have to be a 5-year goal. And if it's aspirational, it may be better for it not to be a 5-year goal. So I think that's also puts, if we're going to have sort of a number to serve a purpose, we might want to look at that differently. And then continue to work on this 5-year cycle on the specificity of what we're trying to accomplish. So I think we can be more flexible about it, and now that you all have the ordinance recommendations, we're moving on.
You might be moving on.
So in terms of next steps for the tree canopy, is this useful feedback to you all, and you can take that back and begin to work together and bring back something more concrete to us in the future?
I'd like to hear kind of what ideas you feel like are on the table, either from a funding perspective or a public policy perspective. Is making the ordinance more flexible and lenient something to do in the face of a goal of expanding and strengthening a canopy? Is a community funding and rebate program something that we should look more into and try to have some accounting eyes look at? Is a staffing increase on the table? Things like that. So of the things you've heard so far, are there like go-ahead items or no-go items? Or, that's interesting. I didn't hear enough about that one, and that's what I want to hear more about.
So I think my impression of the way that our process is going is that this is our first sort of exploratory opportunity, and then from here we can start to condense where everybody is in terms of things that they're interested in pursuing, and we'll have a future work session we're anticipating in September where maybe we can start to distill some of those thoughts. But I also think just the more information we can get from you, if you have specific recommendations in terms of routes that you think are the best way to go. And I mean, ultimately, my impression is that we're going to end up coming down to needing to sort of choose something, and we're not going to know 100% that that's the best way to go, and it's going to be a little bit of trial and error, but we have some great information, and we obviously have a lot of great minds working on it, so to me, that's really encouraging. Yep, Councilmember Seaman?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I've really been impressed with the discussion tonight, and I think I feel confident that in the end, we're going to end up with a new tree ordinance that's based on newer or stronger science than what we've had in the past. Thank you.
I do want to echo Councilmember Siemens' point, and also kind of piggyback off of Councilmember Kostick's encouragement, given that this is, an opportunity to do things differently. We don't want to necessarily stifle creativity by talking about numbers right now, right? So I think it's important for us to just kind of put things on paper and kind of what we think the most appropriate potential thing that we can do to really try to improve the tree canopy. Maybe we take some time to do a little bit of prioritization in some of those future discussions, and then we see how things shake out. But I'm one of those people to just kind of say, let's put your best idea on the paper, on the table now, and we may not be able to fund it this year, but maybe 2 years from now, that idea will get funded. So definitely want to encourage folks to keep thinking creatively about what potential solutions may be, and then we'll talk about the budget later.
And just to piggyback on Councilwoman Searcy, I think it's also helpful if the Joint Committee or the Committee on the Environment or the Tree Commission weigh in on this, on basically what you think is the impact and kind of the biggest bang for the buck. Like, if you tell us, we think as you're moving along, we have 5 ideas, but these top 3 are the one that are actually going to move us the furthest on our goals. That would be helpful, even if you don't have a full assessment, but just what your feelings are on that. I think would also help us kind of evaluate it.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for being here. I also want to make sure I thank the staff members, Ms. Braithwaite and Mr. Van Zupten, and our city attorney as well, for being here and for your recommendations as well, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about more in the fall. So thank you all, and this is just the beginning. We'll have more discussions in the future.
See you Wednesday night.